The Paul Leslie Hour, helping people tell their stories. And now, your host, Paul Leslie.
Hey, it's me. Hello and welcome to the Paul Leslie Hour. I am honored that you are here. Thank you so much. It was not long ago I got an email from Bill Boggs. He was nice enough to write, and it reminded me of our mutual love of Frank Sinatra. And this interview we did in 2016, it was to celebrate Sinatra 101 years since the birth of the great singer. This was broadcast on the radio in Charleston, South Carolina, and it has not been available as a podcast until now. I wanted to get this out there. To tell you a little bit more about the man, Bill Boggs is a 4-time Emmy Award-winning television host, interviewer, and author. As a broadcast journalist, Bill Boggs interviewed many famous figures, but perhaps none as legendary as the singer and actor Frank Sinatra. The historic first-ever TV talk show interview with Frank Sinatra was hosted by Bill Boggs. Boggs once said, "Much of my life has been intertwined with Frank Sinatra's." He was kind enough to join me for a second time on the Paul Leslie Hour, where we took a close look at Frank Sinatra, who has been called one of the most popular and influential musical artists of the 20th century. The Paul Leslie Hour is made possible by listeners and viewers like you. Go to www.thepaulleslie.com and click on Support the Show. It only takes a moment and means the world. Consider telling someone, online or in person, about this interview. Let's get into the second interview with Bill Boggs, right here on the Paul Leslie Hour. Ladies and gentlemen, the man we're presenting here, Bill Boggs, for an interview so neat we need to repeat. This is a man cut out of the same cloth as Dick Cavett and Steve Allen, but anyone who knows Bill Boggs knows that his life has been intertwined with Frank Sinatra's. So in celebration of Sinatra 101, we welcome Bill Boggs. Thank you for making the time.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's a lovely introduction, and happy December 12th, and happy Frank Sinatra's birthday. We can sing happy birthday to Frank, but we won't sound as good as he does, so let's let it go at happy birthday, Frank.
Indeed. Well, I think when you look at someone's life, it's not a bad idea to start at the beginning. Maybe you could tell a bit about the birth of Frank Sinatra to our listeners.
Well, yeah. Well, it was 1915, right? 101 years ago today. And it was a home birth, with a midwife, not in the hospital, that over in Hoboken. And in attendance was a midwife and, I guess like a maternal aunt and maybe a couple other women. And Sinatra was a gigantic baby. He was about 14 pounds. And the birth was extremely complicated, a breech birth. They, to get the baby Sinatra out, they had to use forceps that ripped off half of his right ear and put scars across his neck and halfway down his back. Later in life, the ear was partially corrected by plastic surgery, but if you look at any straight head-on shot, Frank, one ear is different than the other. And then, after they finally, had somehow gotten baby out, they left the baby for dead, thinking that he was stillborn, and they were working feverishly. Obviously, a doctor had been summoned, I suppose. They had probably given him a phone in 1915, but to save his mother Dolly's life. And then the maternal aunt, seeing baby newborn Sinatra's there, took him over to one of those old cast iron sinks that have in the basement. I believe the birth was in the basement of the house in Hoboken, and held the baby by his ankles and feet under really cold torrent of water from the faucet, and smashed his back until the fluid cleared from his lungs and he took his first breaths. So Sinatra literally came into the world fighting for his life. That's an actual literal fact.
do you think in some ways that was kind of some foreshadowing, fighting for life?
Well, I think so. I think so. It's just like Elvis Presley was born twins. He had a twin brother named Aaron, and the twin brother died at birth. And his mother, Gladys Presley, always said, that Elvis has the energy of two boys. So, yeah, maybe. I mean, when Sinatra was on his deathbed at the hospital, Cedars-Sinai Hospital in L.A., Nancy Sinatra is reported to have said, fight, Dad, fight. And Frank responded by saying, I am fighting, but I'm losing. That's supposed to be among his last words. So it's a pretty dramatic birth and death.
What is it about Frank Sinatra that makes him such an intriguing person that we want to learn so much about him?
It's a giant question, Paul. I mean, you can start with, obviously, the music. You can start with the confidence that he conveyed. You can start with the charisma that he projected. The story of his life, the rise, the fall. I think that he is a star who really appealed equally to men and women. There are many great stars today. Like, I think if you look at, say, Paul McCartney, Bruce Springsteen, it's probably the same with them, that they appeal equally to men and women. It's not always the case. So there's just a lot of reasons why Sinatra captured people's imaginations early on. I think a lot of, part of it, I think, is a great lesson. There's a lot to be learned from the lessons of great and successful people. In my in my 2008 book, Got What It Takes, I have this quote right at the beginning by Wordsworth. Lives of great men all remind us that we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. So I think studying Frank's life is interesting. I've always been fascinated by his absolute raving ambition and confidence to deliver the goods behind that ambition. It's one thing to be very ambitious, and he was a highly ambitious man. The other thing is you have to have the talent to back it up.
What do you think his greatest talent was? I mean, the obvious answer, I think, to a lot of people is his voice, but we can't forget his acting. But just tell us a little bit about that. If you could put it into words, his greatest talent.
I think his greatest talent was singing and making you believe that he was singing to you. The sense of intimacy that he conveyed while singing. My mother, as a Bobby Soxer, said and my mother loved music. When first time she saw Sinatra, she said, I felt like he was singing directly to me. But that you do not feel with all singers. But some you do, some you don't. But I think that was probably the greatest capacity that he had. There was a huge amount of other things there, but I'll pick that as number one.
How do you think he accomplished that, the ability to make the listener feel like he was singing directly to him or her?
I don't really know. I know that when I interviewed Frank Sinatra, I asked him about the emotionality in some of, in the ballads. When I said I felt like, I've seen you many times, that when you're singing these great ballads, like Here's That Rainy Day, It's 2:45, Come Rain or Come Shine, whatever. I feel like these are real emotions. And Frank said, yes, I think they are. And then he went on to elaborate, which should be a lesson for any singer. He said, I think that what I do is if I pick a piece of material that's in the ballad vein, what I try to do is put myself in the position of the person who would be experiencing that at that time. And thus, by the song, I'm making the case that person would make. And then he said, I've worked like that all the way back from the very beginning. So that's a partial answer, I think, a partial answer. Part of it may just be the actual timbre of his voice. And I think that his acting ability, which you mentioned, when you phrased the question, he was absolutely a great actor. That if you believe, I got the world on a string, sitting on a rainbow, that he was experiencing that at that time. I think that helped you feel that you were experiencing it at that time. That's excellent communication with you.
Our special guest is Bill Boggs. As you mentioned, your mother, a big fan of Frank Sinatra, and you also mentioned your son having the opportunity to see Frank Sinatra, I think you said 7 times.
That's correct.
So Frank Sinatra, it's in your blood.
My son is a third generation Sinatra fan. That's absolutely right. And he met Frank backstage at Radio City Music Hall before a rare Saturday matinee. Frank had to cancel shows because his voice was bad. He had a horrible cold. He wanted to go on, but Dr. Glenn Corrigan, who was his doctor, the same doctor who, by the way, was involved in the unfortunate demise of Joan Rivers, went to Radio City Music Hall and examined him and said, "You cannot go on. You're going to really hurt yourself if you do." So he had to cancel a show, and that show was made up a rare Saturday matinee at Radio City Music Hall with the evening show that night. And Trevor and I went because we had been to the show that got canceled. And so we were sitting there and the show got canceled. We ran around outside. We saw Frank coming out, getting into his car, looking pretty sad, dejected that he wasn't able to go on. I mean, we're not talking about a Kanye West here who had temporary psychosis. He was really sick.
For anyone out there who's listening, most people, I would guess, have not had the opportunity to see Frank Sinatra in performance. If you could describe what that's like to see a Frank Sinatra concert.
Well, I would recommend trying to get and it's easy to get. There's a series of live concert shows called the Concert Sinatra on DVD. And the one I like best is the one from London, Royal Festival Hall. That's a fabulous live show. There was a real, look, think of anyone you like, okay? What it would be like anticipating they're going to come on stage. The way it worked was there would be some form of open. Show was called for 8 o'clock, right? Started 8 o'clock on the dot. Never like 8:10, 8:12, 8 o'clock. The opening act could have been like a comedian. I've seen Don Rickles, Freddie Roman, a lot of Dick Capri, a lot of different comedians opening Red Buttons, opening for Frank. Or it could have been, every once in a while, he'd have a singer opening. I saw John Pizzarelli open. I saw Oscar Peterson open for Frank. I saw Count Basie open for Frank. I saw Ella Fitzgerald open for Frank. So there would be an opening act. In the case of Ella, that was a full concert at the U.S. Theater, not like, a nightclub. Then there'd be an intermission. And, like it would always be this sort of, letdown when the comedian goes off because the people who were unfamiliar with the format didn't know there's going to be an intermission, right? I saw Frank Sinatra so much, at some point, like when he was at Carnegie Hall around the corner from me, I could time it to like have 4 or 5 people in my apartment drinking champagne, leave the apartment, walk from Central Park South, Columbus Circle, around the corner to 57th Street and 7th Avenue, and walk into Carnegie Hall, walk down to our seats, and 2 minutes later, Frank would come out. 5 minutes later, 3 minutes later. I could time it that well. I knew what was going on. So Frank would come out, and it's always extremely exciting. It's like, I took Ian Hunter once, the rock musician, to see Frank. And when Frank came out, Ian Hunter turned and he said, "There he is." Like, wow, that person you've heard about all your life, seen in movies and on TV, but they're standing there. That person is actually standing there. And it's always generally an up-tempo number. Where or When was one of my very favorite openers of his because it had sort of a mystical quality. Or I've Got the World on a String. One time I saw Frank at Radio City Music Hall. His opening number was New York, New York. He opened with New York, New York, which ended up being his closer. That was very exciting. And so there was like an electric presence because he himself generated an electric presence. And then he settled in, and what was basically usually an hour and 10 minutes of music took on a panoramic aura of the emotions that were covered, the colorations in the songs. And when it was over, you almost, you had gone through some ups and some downs and felt that you had spent much more than, say, an hour and 10 or an hour and 15 minutes. But Frank had a great economy of style. In all the times I saw him perform, more than 100 times, I never once felt he's going on too long, which, I've seen Springsteen, and I like Springsteen, and I thought he's going on too long. This is just too long. 3 hours is too long. But that doesn't mean anything's wrong with him. People love him for 3 hours. That's just my personal taste. Always remember, Nietzsche said, one absolute in life is taste cannot be debated. People will always disagree about taste. I never argue about taste. Oh, I didn't like Sammy Davis. Well, I did. I can't convince them to like somebody they don't like. Anyway, so it was an extremely electric atmosphere.
And in the recordings, I think a lot of people would say that there's a definite atmosphere as well. And for anyone out there who's looking to begin their journey into Sinatra listening, Frank Sinatra left behind just an incredible discography, so much work. What album do you, Bill Boggs, recommend to a beginner?
Well, that's an excellent question. You either can go in the direction of all ballads or all up-tempo, or a blend like Come Fly With Me. I would say start with an up-tempo album from the mid-'50s. It's like the shank of the great work of Nelson Riddle, like Songs for Swingin' Lovers or A Swingin' Affair. They're all standards, and the beat on those albums, the orchestrations by Nelson Riddle, really represented a departure from anything that had been recorded exactly in that way before. Now, when you hear like You're Too Marvelous for Words or I've Got You Under My Skin, they're like really iconic arrangements. But these were, when people heard them for the first time, there was a newness to it in terms of the orchestrations and the jazz inflection. So I would say start with that as a up-tempo. And then the next one I would get would be Nice and Easy. Well, Nice and Easy is a beautiful ballad album recorded in 1959, again with Nelson Riddle, that has the up-tempo, mid-range tempo song Nice and Easy, written by the Bergmans. But then the rest of the album is just beautifully sung ballads. It's not like a suicide album. It's not an album like Only the Lonely, Wee Small Hours of the Morning, Where Are You? It's not like one of those albums of despair and longing.
You mentioned that in a Frank Sinatra concert, you feel all of the ups and downs of human emotion. And not unlike his life. A lot of people forget that although Frank Sinatra was this huge star, and still is, that he had a downfall and he had a comeback.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's quite true. It's very important to understand the totality of someone's life. Let me talk about Elvis for a minute. I worked with, when I was at Channel 4 anchoring the news in New York, I worked with an anchor who went to an Ivy League school, and an intelligent woman who only thought Elvis Presley was a fat guy in funny suits in Las Vegas. She had no idea the totality of what Elvis Presley was. This amazingly handsome guy who revolutionized rock and roll, who brought the guitar into mainstream American life. Prior to that, everybody played the piano, was learning to play the piano. So you have to look at the totality of Elvis's life. He got addicted to uppers, speed in the Army, and never really shook that addiction. That's an element people don't know about. And of course, he had terrible eating habits, and he lived like a recluse. He didn't have a normal life like Frank Sinatra. If you look at Elvis and Michael Jackson, gigantic, singular stars like Frank with their own imprint, but neither one of them had a normal life. They didn't go out walking around, but Frank would go to restaurants when he was in New York, or or in Beverly Hills, whoever he was. If Frank did a show in Milwaukee, he might end up at the Muleback Hotel at the bar at 3 o'clock in the morning. He went out. When I interviewed him, he said he loves to walk down Madison Avenue, go shopping. He had to be careful where I go. If I go to Coney Island, I can get mobbed, but that's understandable. Just like Drew Carey was with him once at Disneyland. He spent 2 hours signing autographs. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that you have to understand the totality of someone's life, but in order to not remember them just as they were at the end, So what happened to Frank was, now, anyone listening that was paying attention will probably be shocked by this, but Frank was a teen idol, very much like Justin Bieber. This is pretty much before the teen culture that came in with Elvis. So Frank had these very young, predominantly female fans, and they were with him, but teen fans are fickle. So by the late 40s, Frank was the highest paid star in the world. By the early 50s, music tastes had changed. His personal life was in turmoil because of running around with Ava Gardner when he was married to Nancy had children. I mean, this is like scandalous. These days, celebrities are having sex changes on television, but now, back then in 1940, 50, so he really lost his audience. And Sinatra went from being the highest paid star in the world to somebody who was literally counted out of the business. No real record contract, no real agent. Once flew with just a pianist all the way from LA to Hawaii to make $1,500 and ended up doing a show in a tent in the rain to make that money. And yet he came back. And he came back not by his singing, but by his acting ability, by getting the part, flying all the way from Africa to Los Angeles to audition for a part that he said he would do for scale in From Here to Eternity. The part had already been assigned to Eli Wallach, and Frank's wife, Ava, petitioned the producers of the movie. Ava Gardner was a very successful actress. She was, at the time, way more successful than Frank when they were married, which couldn't have been easy for him. But anyway, so Frank auditioned and got that part and won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. And that night that he won the Academy Award, he didn't go to the big party at Chasen's. He didn't go to any of the governor's ball or anything like that. He took his daughter Nancy home because Nancy, his daughter, accompanied him. And he got in his car, he drove into Beverly Hills, he parked the car, and he walked around in the dark for 2 hours with the Oscar in his hand, realizing, I'm back.
Wow. Is there a song from Frank Sinatra's that you would say, from an emotional standpoint, most resonates with you?
Oh, sure. My theme song is That's Life.
And why is that?
Well, because that's how I look at life. You're riding high in April, and I shot down in May. I'm going to change their tune when I'm back on top in June. And I think you have to always recognize that it's easy to be happy during the good times, but when you get knocked down, you have to get up. It's one of the many autobiographical songs that Sinatra recorded, and I like it because it's a semi-rock. I love rock and roll. And it's like it's a very bluesy song, That's Life. That's been my theme song for many, many years. There are dozens of Sinatra songs I love, but That's Life is my theme song. It's not my favorite song. My favorite song of all time is As, A-S, by Stevie Wonder, from the album Songs in the Key of Love.
So having had the opportunity to be in the presence of Frank Sinatra, what would you describe that as like, to be in the presence of Frank Sinatra?
Well, that's a good question. You know what I realized, Paul? I said this to my friend Joe DeAnthony the other day. When I first met Frank, I was a young guy. I was like 32 years old, right? And now I'm in my 70s, and I'm one of those guys who knew Frank. I'm one of those guys who, when I was 32, wow, he knows Frank. I became that person. And that's really interesting to me that I could be on the radio talking about Frank like this because of the fact that I did that interview with him all those years ago, in 1975, the longest interview of his career on Midday Live with Bill Boggs. Anyway, so I guess I was probably, other than the interview and meeting Frank in Vegas and seeing him the next night, I was probably in his, I have records of it. If I had to write it down, I could write down every time I was with Frank backstage at a couple of parties, one party in New York, one party in Atlantic City. I took a lovely picture of Frank with my mother, probably with 15, 18 times, and have letters from Frank. One about a TV show I did that he liked. Very nice letter from him. Anyway, there are people who have what the Marines call command posture. And Paul, command posture is a British military term, and it means in a room full of officers, all dressed up in their uniforms, like on a Saturday night at some kind of a function, in that room full of, say, 30 officers, the officer who has command posture is the officer who projects the most authority simply by the way he carries himself. And Sinatra had command posture. You could feel the energy coming off Frank, even if he was behind you. It's just one of those intangible qualities that some people have. So it was always interesting to look in his face and his amazingly cobalt blue eyes, the handsome, interesting face. He had that ability, which is a very important ability, to really be with you in the moment, even if it might have been like 12 other people backstage. It was always, hey, Billy, how you doing? Looking directly at him. Wasn't like looking over my shoulder to see who's coming in. That's a good quality. Everybody should try to cultivate that quality. So I think that being in Frank's presence was always hugely special for me because I'm a fan. But again, he radiated an energy that I think comes from an inner core of confidence.
On your website, billboggs.com, there is a link to Bill Boggs TV, and there's a lot of content.
YouTube,
yeah, your right. YouTube. And one of the things I found on the YouTube channel I was watching was the clip of you and Frank Sinatra together.
Oh, yeah. A little clip from my long interview. I put the toast on the very end of the interview. I asked Frank to make a toast, similar to the one he was giving at the Euros Theater every night to all of our viewers. And the toast really holds up. All these years later, 40 years later, the toast still holds up.
Well, from that interview that you did with Frank Sinatra, what would you say is the biggest thing that you learned?
What he said about ballad singing. There's no other record of Frank Sinatra talking about that. What he said, and I asked him. I didn't ask him like gossipy crap. The reason he did the interview was he knew instinctively he could trust me. I never asked him to come and be on my show, Paul. We met at 4:00 in the morning. We were introduced by his friend Julie Rizzo. 4:00 in the morning in Las Vegas. After that very night, with a friend of mine, Elaine Jessemer, author of the best-selling book *1 with a Bullet*, and we went to see Elvis Presley first show, Frank Sinatra second show. That was a big night. It was her birthday, and after the show, she went back to her room, and I wandered around, ran into Julie, who said, "Would you like to meet Frank?" Julie knew me from TV and from work I did with Sammy Davis Jr. And an hour later, he said, "Be over at that lounge in an hour," which turned out to be 4:00 in the morning. He introduced me to Frank. We talked for 10, 12 minutes. Frank immediately knew he could trust me. Immediately knew it. And we had just a conversation. It was like no BS. And at the end of the conversation, he said, "Julie says you have a show on 5 in New York?" "Yes." He says, "I don't want to promise anything. This is Easter Sunday morning, so it's April. But maybe I'll come by and do your show. I'm going to be in New York with Ellen Basie in September." And he did. It was just one of those things was meant to be. When I say that, I don't mean that bragging, but it was in the cards that was going to happen. I had a dream before I went to Las Vegas that I was going to meet Frank and he was going to come and do my show. It was like a prescient a prescient dream. I actually had it, told the executive producer, I've got Paul. I said, I've got this feeling. I'm going to meet Frank this weekend. He's going to come and do midnight. And Paul laughed in my face, and it happened. So it was meant to be. It was a long interview, but basically stage technique, ballad singing. Frank hated it. He said, always hated when I go to someone's house and I'm in their house at a dinner and they've got my music playing in the background. I can understand that. I said, I don't like it when anybody's playing your music as background music. I don't like any vocals. You go to someone's house, 12, 15 people standing around, and they have music on in the background. Not that you're listening to with someone singing songs. You can't quite hear them. It's just noise. If you want background music, play like jazz or instrumentals, not vocals. That's the best advice I could give anybody who's having a party. Unless you want to dance, but otherwise, why play music with words that you can't hear?
That's a good point.
You got me going here, Paul. You got me going.
Good. Well,
Bill Boggs, social tips. Anytime you want to do something on entertaining or civility, Paul, I want to form something called the Civility Project that would be like commercials about how to act civil in various situations, like not honking your horn endlessly at 4 o'clock in the morning because somebody's blocking you, like civil behavior. I'm all for civil behavior. Not civil disobedience, civil behavior.
Well, manners maketh man, right?
Manners are important.
Indeed.
Sinatra had impeccable manners. Yes.
There have been a few people that have told me that about his manners, that he
very good manners. Right.
Always stood when a woman entered the room.
Right.
Had a lot of those types of traits.
That's correct. That's right, Paul.
Well, something about interviewees is that, sometimes you have people, I'm sure you've experienced this, where you ask them a question and you ask them, for example, what was that like? And they say, it was good. And you're like, okay, well, tell us, what was Frank Sinatra like to interview? Did he know how to give a good interview?
Oh, that's interesting. No one ever asked me that, actually, Paul. It was very simple. I set it up like a conversation, not an interview. Obviously, I was the leader of the conversation, but it wasn't like question number 1, question number 2. It was I followed him and I followed what he said. I listened to it and just kind of continued the conversation from there. So although obviously it was an interview, it comes off more like a conversation between two people.
He had a good awareness of like, am I talking too much? Am I talking too little? He knew that kind of stuff instinctively.
I think so.
Yeah.
One of the things that was interesting was he says near the end, he says, it's the first time I've ever been on a show like this. That was interesting. Here I am, Bill Boggs. Bill Boggs, this kid from Northeast Philadelphia, right, whose mother was a body soxer, had Frank Sinatra on my show, and he says, I've never been on a show like this before. I forgot that he said that, but a couple of years ago, I did the interview in 1975, and I never watched it again until 2001. It was like I'm not obsessed with my interviews. And when I watched it again in 2001 with Peter Sinatras and some people, I took in stuff that I had totally forgotten, like that.
There are some books out there about Frank Sinatra. The one that I in particular really like is The Way You Wear Your Hat by Bill Zamey.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's good. I like The Way You Wear Your Hat.
And then they did the Sinatra 100 book last year. I was hoping you could tell us, what books do you recommend for those interested in reading?
Unquestionably, The Song Is You by Will Friedwald. That is a great book. Because it tracks his recording career. The Song Is You by Will Friedwald. And then our friend James Kaplan, 2 books, Volume 1, The Voice, and Volume 2, The Chairman, both by Doubleday.
Why in particular do you recommend the Friedwald book? I have to admit, I hadn't heard of that book. Tell us about it.
Well, the Will Friedwald book deals with his recording career in depth. If you really know his music, it's fascinating. I've read it twice, and he's doing a new version of it with going back and adding a lot of new material. It's called The Song Is You. It's excellent.
I was hoping you could also tell us about some of the performers that have carried on the flame. For example, Robert Davi, a lot of people know as an actor, but also
Robert
a singer.
Davi. Yes, Robert. Well, there's a lot of singers out there. I like Tony. What I like are singers who do not echo or imitate Sinatra. Like Michael Bublé, to me, is very derivative. Actually, my favorite singer of material of the Great American Songbook, somebody who could sing "I've Got You Under My Skin" or "Mac the Knife" and make it totally their own, is Bobby Rydell. Bobby Rydell is one of the. I'll put Bobby Rydell against any male singer singing that kind of material in America. I also like Jack Jones a lot. Michael Feinstein is very smooth. Feinstein is more like a Johnny Mathis type singer, not an emotional singer like Frank. He's just a great voice and really carries on the tradition. So I like seeing Michael Feinstein. My top, Steve Tyrell, again, doesn't imitate Frank. His movements aren't like Frank. His phrasing isn't like Frank. I don't like to go see shows of Frank Sinatra music because when you've seen the real thing 100 times, you don't have a real hunger to see somebody else do it. But I'll tell anybody out there who likes music, if you see Bobby Rydell coming around, catch him. He started out as a drummer at age 4. He has tremendous time sense, just like Peggy Lee has tremendous time sense. And was like a teen idol who just continued to evolve into a terrific singer and performer. And you should interview him sometime. As a matter of fact, he has a book out called Teen Idol on the Rocks.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I suggest interviewing him and Will Freewall as 2 people you want to talk to.
I'm definitely going to follow up on the Freewall in particular.
Yeah.
How would you describe the influence that Frank Sinatra has had on your life?
I think that I am constantly striving to. I think that I'm a natural performer since I was a little kid, and I think by seeing Frank perform more than 100 times, a lot of it I absorbed in terms of projecting energy and confidence, and meaning what you say when you say it. The ability to bounce back, in any long career, you're going to have some valleys, There can be a blessing in a valley. In any long career, you're going to have some downs, and you got to be able to get up. Very important.
Why does Sinatra still matter?
Because of his music, because he had recorded over 1,500 songs, many of them the greatest songs ever written, many of them, some not, like the song "Satisfy Me One More Time." Now, that is really an awful song. I can't stand it, but great songs. I think that's why it matters, because as Steve Wynn said, because of Sinatra, we saw how great the music could be. I love that quote. Because of Sinatra, we saw how great the music could be. So today on Sinatra's birthday, everybody should try to reach into their record collection or CD collection or go to Apple Music and put on That's Life. And just listen to it and feel the vibrancy of it all and see how it may or may not apply to your own life. And remember Frank, because he's always going to be with us, one way or the other.
Well, Mr. Boggs, thank you very much for sharing with us.
Paul, you're terrific. Thank you. You really got me talking today. My lovely, lovely, lovely better half, she is my better half, just came into our apartment. I haven't seen her in 10 days. She's wearing a beautiful red sweater, so I'm going to hang up. Thank you for being on the radio, and go give her a hug.
All right.
You want an interesting interview subject. Jane Rothschild, my girlfriend, she is Sammy Kahn's cousin, and she worked with both Johnny Carson and Dick Clark, and really has some interesting stories about how she got those jobs and her early days in show business. She's won a couple Emmys. So if you ever need a guest to talk about really how to go out there and get a job, her stories about how she worked with Carson is great. It's a really great story, right out of college. That's another show for another day.
Put in a good word for me there.
Will do.
All right.
Bye-bye, Paul. Thank you.
Ba doodly beep bop dee da dee bumpity boo rapati na's a jip pop killa can not a gill bond a good thing jiga manga but yeah hunger I guess I get back in the woo e daga go I got the inga rocket tangle lang a bo a kick oh goodbye.